Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Care Live. My name is Matt Scott, and this is the Saturday Live Conversation series kicking off this month. All month long, I will be doing these Saturday conversations with some really incredible change makers and people who, coincidentally, each one kind of ties to the next very unintentionally, but right now, we are here with none other than Amy Wilson, who's the author of Empathy for Change. But I know her in so many other contexts, which we will talk about. And without further ado, I am going to bring on Amy. Amy.
Hi.
How are you doing? I'm great. I'm glad to see you here. And how are you doing? How's everything considering the world we live in?
Yeah, I'm still in a pandemic,
Yes.
but I'm doing wonderful today. I'm like with family and I get to talk to one of my favorite people, which is you.
Whoa. That's really intense. So I appreciate that. And it's exciting to hear that you're with family. It's good to have those moments when we can, now especially. So I'm happy to have you here. Happy to talk with you. I'm gonna I'm gonna remove the branding, make it nice and casual. But I'm glad to have you. Glad to dive into more of your story. That's what Let's Care is all about, the human behind the impact. And so just as we start out, without further ado, I want to give you a chance to just introduce yourself and tell people who you are at whatever level you'd like to start us out. We will definitely dive in a lot deeper.
Yeah, I'm going to just do like high level because there's so much to talk about. And I think my resume, like if last time I did it, like 12 pages long with all the things that I've done. So I like to say that I'm a public entrepreneur. So I grew in this world of trying to be an entrepreneurial person, but doing it for the public good. So that's one thing to note about me. And I've done that in multiple ways. And I'm also a policy entrepreneur. So most recently, I was an Aspen Tech Policy Hub fellow. So we were doing a tech policy fellowship. I was in San Francisco last year. I usually live in Washington, D.C. So what we do is try to think about taking really big systemic problems and trying to be an entrepreneur and solve those problems with policy and seeing how the change we want to see in the world and make it in a bigger way. So, then I'm also an innovation and a change expert as well.
Yeah, and I think just as we start to dive in, because there's a lot with your background we'll get into, like where does your journey begin? Could you tell us more about even beyond or before just the different careers? Like what's your backstory? Where are you coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I come from I guess like the backstory. I say that like my story goes in like 5-year increments. So I started, I would say I graduated in 2004 from undergrad. And so I started around that time doing some management consulting with the Army actually. But then this was in 2005 or so. And then Hurricane Katrina happened. And for me, I did a lot of Habitat for Humanity back in college, and I spent a lot of my summers and winters in the Gulf Coast. And so for me, when Hurricane Katrina happened, like it really hit me like a ton of bricks. And so I decided to quit my job and go into AmeriCorps, the National Civilian Community Corps. And so that's like a team-based service. I was like, I'm going to go straight to be a team leader. And during that experience, I was living in a gutted out elementary school. I was building and growing, this team, but also when I was there, I built this project called Build 50 Homes in 4 months after the hurricane. So I was thrown into leadership at that moment, and I had to be very resourceful using all these resources across the Gulf Coast and thousands of volunteers to build these homes during that time. And then I also would say after that, the next kind of milestone that I can point out is in 2010. I came back to DC after that time, and I started doing management consulting again. But then I started working at Booz Allen Hamilton, and that at that time the company was getting ready to turn 100 years old. And so it's kind of an ancient and they were one of the people who created, management consulting out there. So when I was there, they were going through a lot of changes. And in 2012, I was asked to help lead this effort called Building a Culture of Innovation. And so during that experience, what we did is, brought this team together, started understanding what does change and innovation mean in the context of consulting, and how do we change a 25,000 person firm to be one that's more modern and more focused on what we need to do today.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So like 100 years, right? So think about like 100 years ago, there was another flu, right? the flu that was taking over us. Now we're in this pandemic, and and a lot of things have changed since then. So that happened, and then in 2015, it was a year transition. I had just been working 80-hour weeks at Booz Allen, and just trying to do all this impact, trying to do it. And I was just so connected to my job. And I kind of was like, I need a change. I need a shift. And during that time, thankfully, I was selected to be a presidential innovation fellow with the White House. And it was at the time, it was the Obama administration. And it's the last 18 months or so of the administration. So I got a chance to work with tons of public servants across government to understand what does public sector innovation mean, and what does change mean in the public sector, right? In the government, which is very different than it is in the private sector, right? So I had my foot in this these pies. We know I was at Booz Allen, like creating the innovation ecosystem, creating this place where like this is our blueprint for what this is. So I kind of took a lot of that knowledge from there and brought it into the federal government. But I also came with an open mind, thinking that my assumptions of what it works in the private sector is probably not going to work in the public sector, Right. So I actually started creating around that same time. Like we did a bunch of research at the end of the Obama administration. Then 2 weeks before the election of 2016, I stepped into a new role to be director of innovation.gov. Which eventually became innovation.gov. So my job was to take this knowledge that we have, create a shared language, and then spread it across government.
Yeah.
So no big
easy.
Easy
do that, right? Yeah, definitely.
And which this thing had never really been done before. So just charting on the course, right? So when I was there, I kind of just like, well, I can't do this alone. I need to bring people from across government together. So, as the transition happened between the two administrations, there was a lot of consternation that happened, like a lot of being like, oh, we're in a new place now. And out of necessity, I started convening the people that we had engaged with, 150 so people. And we started asking, who are we talking to? What are we doing? Just very, very open. And then we realized that we wanted to create an open and participatory movement, right? Which we ended up calling the Better Government Movement. And then it kind of caught on like wildfire. We had about 5,000 people join in just this 2 years that we were building it. And also I learned how to build innovation.gov and code it. So we coded it together. We created a shared language. It wasn't just me, it was hundreds of people from across government. So it was quite a thing. And in 2018 was when everything was like really at a fever pitch. And it was during that time when I started, the new administration had started to having like a vision that they wanted to kind of put forward about 2 years into the presidency. So I got into that meeting. I started taking on a new role that they wanted me to take on around a center of excellence around transforming agencies. So at that time, during that experience is when I got to kind of work more closely with this new administration, and I realized that the mission and the values of this administration did not match what the 5,000 people in the movement had done.
Yep.
So, can you imagine?
I don't know. Yeah, it's so powerful to hear, and I like, even just to stop it in for a second with what you're saying, to give you a second to take a breath too. Like, I just want to say it's been great to see different parts of your journey that you've mentioned. So as you were working on innovation.gov, I even think like, as you were just starting to work on that and on the Better Government movement, even before that, we met through the White House Open Data Innovation Summit. Who dis? So we go way. Who dis? Who? I don't even know what who dat is, but who? Well, we'll figure that out. But it's been cool to witness the journey, and I'll also just say for those who are watching, like, to get a touch point here. As you talk about the government and it being not aligned, because which I think is so interesting. I want to get back to that in a second. Is that I really feel like so much of your experience I could relate to from my perspective, because as you were doing all of that work, I was working at the Innovation Agency Second Muse, of course, and the initiative we met through was the National Day of Civic Hacking, but my main project was NASA's Space Apps Challenge, and I started during the Obama administration, and I left that work in November last year, really like right as the Trump administration was ending, but I still saw some of what I've heard you share already in your journey about it, like the different values. And so just to get back to that, like, how did that disconnect in values manifest for you? Because it seems like there was at least this sense of like, okay, Amy, like, you're here, you're an innovator, you're a public innovator, you're an ecosystem builder, all of that. Let's put that to work. But then, while that might have been what they were asking for, that's not how it turned out, is kind of what I'm hearing from your journey. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, I learned a whole lot from that experience. So the work that was created, and a lot of it centered around policy, to tell you the truth. So there was this, policy that was created in the Obama administration called the Strategy for American Innovation in 2015. That was written like right around the time I was coming into the PIF program that was released. And during that, they wrote this Office of Science and Technology Policy, which I worked with very closely on this work, wrote and said, you know what, there's been so many innovations that have happened in the Obama administration. We need to codify it. And we want to create, they called it an innovation toolkit back then. But they hadn't done a ton of the research over like, what do people even want to have? And how might we get this out in the world, right? And so that strategy was created, but it's not like a law. Like when people think policy, they think, legislation in the legislative branch, right?
Right.
It wasn't a law that said this must exist, right? Like in the sense of like, and you like, because there's different branches of government, right? Like that's one of the major differences of like, public sector, private sector differences is like, there's checks and balances, right? So the legislative branch, there wasn't like a law that said this innovation.gov should exist, right? And then there's also, like, and as a example, one of my sister organizations was called digital.gov. And it was like, I worked very closely with the head of digital.gov, and he was redesigning and rethinking what that was. And that had been around for about a decade, right? But there was a legislation that kept it there and made it think about like, made it be established. And it's like getting appropriations every year, right? And that's how the appropriations process happens. Innovation.gov, on the other hand, was something that we had to secure funding for, right? The Obama White House sort of secured funding from like DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which, and NSF or something like that, like a couple other organizations that they had gotten funding from. So like the problem is like what was happening when I was coming up against 2018 when I left was that funding was running out. and I didn't have regular funding coming in. So when we talk about values, right? So when the transition happened, that there was no mandate from the policy perspective to say this must exist. Unlike this was innovation.gov is different than digital.gov. Digital.gov has to exist and there has to have all these things. And so this is why I ended up doing one of the reasons why I did the Tech Policy Fellowship, because I was like, I need to understand policy so much more, right? For what we were doing. And so, but that's one thing when we talk about policy. But on the other end, there was a challenge that I was coming up against where, and I didn't really realize this until after I left in 2018. So. Mm-hmm. So this is something that when people say that you need to have time to reflect on the experience that you had, this is one of the major reasons why, because you're like, oh man, my aha moment came.
Right.
And I was doing a keynote at NIH. It was during when I was taking my sabbatical in 2019. And I remember talking to one of the executives there, and he was like, have you ever read this book called New Power? And have you heard of this book before?
I've not read it, but I would love for you to tell me about it. So it was the executive at NIH, National Institute for Health, for those who are.
Yes. Sorry. In DC, use acronyms all the time.
I'm the translator all the time with acronyms, so no worries.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you're here because sometimes I still have that DC mentality. So National Institutes of Health, and he said that there's this book called New Power, and I read about it. I actually write about it in my book because it's a book that was written that talks about how technology has really shifted us into this place where power is shifting, the dynamics is shifting to the ordinary person, right? Before, when we talk about, we have old power, and then we've got this new power dynamic. So old power is kind of like the 20th century. It's like being on building a Model T, it's not everyone
Model T is. I think they do. Everyone has one of those in their garage still.
That's exactly a car, right? The first car. It's like being on an assembly line, right? And then everybody on the assembly line technically is just doing the thing, and then the person at the top has all the power. It's like top down, leader driven, you do what I tell you to do, right? And you follow along. So that happened, and then so that's old power, right? And it's not very open and transparent, right? It's very, you do what I tell you to do. But when the 21st century came around and technology started becoming pretty ubiquitous, this new thing started happening, things like recently the Arab Spring. We just had we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring that happened, and that was social media was the reason why the Arab Spring happened, right? And so social media, all the things, opportunities for us to connect worldwide, globalization is forcing us in this place of new power, where power in this world is like a current. You can develop that power and shift it to whoever needs it at that moment. And so as a result, things are open and participatory and peer driven. So people are coming together in newfound ways to solve problems. And that, when I read that book and started, when that person was an aha moment, I was like, that's exactly what was happening right now. Right. Yeah. I'm a practitioner. I came into a room, and I didn't finish telling this story, but I'm happy to tell it. But I came into the room, and they were like, you just fall in line, do what I tell you to do. Right. And you work for me and you work for this president, which is what
the White House.
Yeah. The White House. Yeah. The White House, the people who I was working with in the administration said, you work for me and you work for this president. And that was it. That was the last thing he said to me. And then 2 weeks, later, I was, on the chopping room floor. I ended up getting let go of my position. The innovation.gov was in retaliation, was just taken down. And also I was never told to convene the Better Government movement again. It was this place where it was they're threatened, right, in a lot of ways by this movement that I was creating, because for me, and what the research was saying was that culture change happens because of a movement and not a mandate, right? And that mandate is the old way of thinking, the old power. The movement is the new power. So that's what's really interesting and what happened with me in first.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about how you at least like initially reacted to, well, I mean, yeah, I'm curious because part of me is like, well, I would be like really upset or angry or what, but I'm curious how you reacted, because the place where I kind of relate is even thinking about my work on the NASA Space Apps Challenge in this last, thankfully not still, but this administration, but this last administration where a lot of the work that I was doing personally, just based on my identity, especially, and something that I'm always passionate about, is how do we bring more people into the room, especially like looking at the hackathon world and the innovation space. How do we bring in underrepresented voices? So women, people of color, the LGBT community, and other groups that just are not heard and represented and seen as leaders. And something that really happened in the last mid to late last year, but the specific thing I'll reference was September, was when Trump decided no more diversity and inclusion training, no more focus. And that did not affect me directly. That wasn't directly the work that I was doing, but it definitely sent a message that we don't value these things. We don't care about these things. And I did see, like the ripple effects of this idea of like, your identity is second to the priorities of the administration / not getting in trouble with the administration and the president at the time, and so on and so forth. And so I wonder from you, though, just knowing where you were in your career at the time and your life at the time, like how did you process that? Because it would be, I'm guessing it was different than like 28-year-old me processing the information. Like, how did you process all of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. And I'm a decade older than you. I just realized, so so just to give you a sense of like, what this happened, it's interesting because when I looked around, it was very to a lot of other leaders that was leading innovation and change in government. It was not very diverse, right?
Yeah.
And me being a woman in the room in particular was very different than, like many of the women that I came across and engaged with were not in the room necessarily leading things. They were just taking notes, right? And it's like, it sounds like, almost like Mad Men, right?
Yeah.
Like it was just like this environment was like they didn't respect, what people had to offer. And like what happened even before that person said, you work for me and you work for the president, is I came in and I was sharing. I was using a presentation. We call them decks, but so to presentation people. Yeah. And I was like, we have had all this impact. Look at all this amazing impact that we've made. And he stops me mid-sentence and he says, "You're thinking about everything wrong." And that is just like invalidating me, invalidating all of these people, invalidating, and also in the retaliation and everything like that, you're essentially harming so many people who believe that innovation is the key, right? And we need to think about, and the movement was called the Better Government Movement. We thought this would be such a movement that everybody will agree with, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't turn out that way. And so it's so interesting. And if you look at innovation and change, a lot of that new kind of thinking has to do with diversity. And when we talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about like you said, people of color, women, LGBT, but I'm thinking of diversity of thought, right? For example, I'm a first generation American. From my mother was born in a refugee camp after World War II, right? And then I'm also the first generation in my family to go to college. So that is diversity of thought. I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I worked really hard to get where I am. And that's something that's part and parcel of who I am. So I know you asked about like, how did I deal with it? So I'm happy to talk about that. But I don't know if you had anything to comment on what I just talked about.
Yeah, there's a lot, there's definitely a lot there. And the thing that you just even talking about your diversity, because I definitely think of that as diversity, even though you actually bring up a great point, and it's something that's that I think comes up sometimes, and it came up directly in one interview I had now like a year and a half ago, or maybe now a couple years ago. Time is strange these days, but I had like an interview with someone named, yeah, I don't, maybe it was last week. But I had a conversation with someone named Renee Ferris, who was at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation at the time. And I asked her, I was really talking about identity and the importance of identity, and just kind of asking her how she perceived her identity, but also how she felt others perceived her identity. And she said, oh, well, like, I think people might see me as just like a basic white girl, is what she said. And, it was actually a joint interview with someone else. Actually, a couple of people, one a co-host, co-interviewer, co-interviewee. And we kind of said, like, no, we see you as so much more than that. But at times, that is how she's definitely perceived. Just like, you might just be perceived for what people see on the surface. The same goes for me. But thinking about your identity and your background, how do you feel your like identity has influenced your journey? And specifically, I wonder, like, how has your identity influenced the curiosity aspect of your journey? I know that you've talked about like the different levers of empathy, like dignity and humility, curiosity and equity. But I wanted to specifically hear, like, where did that curiosity come from? Was it something based in, being a first generation like student and being like someone who first generation American and all of that, or was it from something else?
Yeah. I think I would say there's so many bits and pieces to this. I think, I write about this in the book that when I was growing up, I grew up in the middle of the woods on 20 acres of land. And my dad was a good old boy from West Virginia, and he was a card carrying member of the NRA. He he would, had a gun next to his bed to protect his family, right? And he was voted for Trump, right? And in a lot of ways, and like the high school that I went to was like 99% white, and like that was the identity that I was brought into. But and in a way, like, and I remember my best friend when I was growing up, his license plate said Mr. GOP. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. And he loved Rush Limbaugh, right? He loved all these things. And I was like, I actually talked a lot because I have 3 sisters and no brothers, but we think about like, how did we like not turn out, like we turned out so different. Like we're all liberal and we're all very successful in our worlds. And what's interesting, I think, and this is something I'm just shooting out for because I didn't actually write about this in the book, but this is what
that's what's about.
This is what's about. And I think this idea of like knowing that my grandmother survived 2 concentration camps in World War II, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that my mother was born in a refugee camp, and which was something that was really relevant. And then knowing that my dad was also an alcoholic. He was an addictive personality. He never dealt with trauma from when he was a child that he never dealt with. So I could see the hurt, and I'm an empath. So I feel the feelings of people around me. I'm also, empathy is my biggest strength as well. So like in a lot of ways, that upbringing has made me who I am. And then also talk about this a little bit in the book. My mother has a disability, and she has rheumatoid arthritis. It's a kind of disease that is it's a debilitating disease where essentially like your immune system attacks your joints as if they're foreign entities. So my mom's hands are disfigured, and she says it's like walking on broken ankles every day. And it's incurable. She has a severe form of it. She is miraculously still walks around, but only can do a very little. But I remember when I was a child that my mom would be because the thing is like her entire body is in pain and she takes, heavy opioids almost every day because that's how she survives, right? She is in massive pain every day. And so I knew that growing up. So I have this this space that was both my mother, I can remember very, very specifically my mother weeping in her room because of the pain that she was in mentally, physically, right? And she's like, how do I get out of this? Right? I'm raising 4 girls. I have a husband who's an alcoholic. I have this debilitating disease. And at the time, this was like 40 years ago, right? They didn't understand rheumatoid arthritis like they do today, right? Yeah. So I think, when I've done a lot of thinking on this, like that experience was very formative for me, right? And it was very clear that because my dad didn't come from a great family and kind of grew up with like alcoholics and a lot of interesting things, and my mom, all of her family was pretty much killed off in the war, right? So I have very little Ukrainian family on that side, on my mom's side. So like this kind of like culture that's here, that was created, they essentially were like family matters, connection and relationships matter. So we're going to prioritize that. And also like, because neither of my parents went to college, they really, really pushed my sisters and I to be like whatever we wanted to be. And one last thing I'll say about this is my mother, there's also this might be a little crazy, but my grandmother, the one who was in the concentration camps, was moved to Baltimore, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and my mother was taken away from her. So my mom was put in an orphanage, and she was quasi adopted by a family, and this family that she was put in said you could either be a nurse, or you could be a homemaker, or you can be a secretary. That's all you can be in life, right? It's limiting. And my mom raised 4 daughters and was like, you can be whatever the hell you want, and she raised us like that. So I became the person to be the only girl on the baseball team. I started doing Habitat for Humanity, and I still love my tool belt. And I learned I've built 60 homes in my life, right?
Right.
I have done things that most men, it's usually an experience where you feel like it's a manly experience, construction. And I lived in that world for a while. So like, I always was like, oh, I'm just going to do whatever I want. But I also was the theater geek, right? And I was really good at, connecting with people, but I didn't really understand myself growing up. But yeah, I just was like, I'm going to do whatever I want, and never thought that was weird until somebody started telling me in my adulthood, like, that's kind of odd. Like, that's not what women do. And I was like, is it?
It's so powerful to hear all of that, though, from you for a couple of reasons. One, just to hear the journey and the twists and turns and the unexpected aspects of it too, because it's something that I've heard a lot recently. Like, one thing that I'm doing it right now, so this is kind of meta and strange, but like one thing I talk about in my interviews, and especially with the anniversary coming up, I've mentioned to you, is like losing my dad, which motivated me to go out and interview people and meet change makers like him on my journey. And something that I've been really proud to hear, and I think the reason why I'm like even now saying it, other than that it's on my mind, is that actually, this is not even where I was totally going, but today or yesterday, I was in an email. I was in YouTube for an email account that I don't really use, but I saw like a live stream that I was doing, recording for work from the month that my dad died. And I was watching the video and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I did not have this level of energy. I was a shell of myself, and it's a little surreal to watch, but also like I was not talking about like the fact that 3 days before that was the memorial service, right? And I didn't put out the stream publicly. I was testing something, but like the difference in comfort speaking up was there. I think we often feel the stigma around sharing our stories. And so I'm so glad that you like feel comfortable sharing those stories, because there are people who listen and say like, oh, I've never listened to an interview where someone's mentioned a family member having schizophrenia or rheumatoid arthritis or like any of these challenges. But I think that's why I think it's so important to share, so that people could relate, because like I'm sure there are people watching who don't know anyone who has or has had schizophrenia, who don't know anyone first generation, who don't know anyone who's had a litany of like the experiences that you've had. So I just wanted to shout out the importance and like thank you for sharing that aspect of your story. But have you like, you're a storyteller. That's like how I initially was introduced to you, like Amy the storyteller. I was like, oh great, that's one of my people here
over there.
But like I'm as a storyteller, like what has been I kind of just want to hear your reactions to that and thoughts on just that idea of sharing your perspective and sharing yourself, and like how effective, this is a leading question, but like how effective has it been, or what response have you had to sharing your story otherwise when you have?
Yeah, it's interesting talking about sharing my story, because I think it has only been in the past 5 years when I felt comfortable sharing, to share about who I am, because often I have spent my career behind something, right? Building a culture of innovation. I haven't been Amy J. Wilson telling my story, right? So I think I've had to grow into it. So that's what I was thinking about, right? Yeah. But like, I've been doing obviously a ton of writing in the past, couple of years. And one of them, like two things come to mind, is like that shock to the system that happened when I was like at Booz Allen, and I had a nervous breakdown, right? And feeling like I needed to be heard and seen amongst my sisters. I talk about that in the book, and I can only remember a handful of times when I really felt heard and seen in my life. But then there's also the time when something happened, at when I was getting fired and like let go from the work that I was doing. And I had a friend who said, I would probably be drunk in a ditch somewhere if I were you, if that happened to me. So, it's really interesting that, I guess it's just like being able to have those experiences has just led me to realize, like, you know what, everybody, we're so much more alike than we are different. There's so many shared experiences. And I think like that is the, I guess you could say, the meaning of life, is to share with other people and to be in community with others. And two other things resonate when you were talking about that, from my experience, is when I was after Hurricane Katrina and like the work that I did in AmeriCorps, I was burnt out. I was only 25 years old, and I was like, I can't do this. Like, it was just like, it was very emotionally draining. So I decided to do a cross-country road trip, because as one does, for 3 months, not just, for 1 week, but for 3 months. And when I was on that trip, there was lots of twists and turns. But on that trip, I started with two people. We didn't get along well. But then by the time we get to the West Coast, mind you, I'm an East Coast girl. Yeah. And we're on the West Coast. My last friend is like, I can't be on this trip anymore. I want to go home. And she's on the East Coast. So I was like, eventually was like, sayonara, fly home, right? This is a girl who lived in rural Maryland, who's never spent a lot of time outside of my house, right? Like out of my, like, and so I didn't do a lot of traveling, and I was my car that we were driving. So I was like, okay, forget you. I'm going to finish this road trip out on my own. Right. So, but that was quite a blessing for me, because in that road trip that I did, I realized that I went from having a focus on the other person I was traveling to then starting to stay in all these different houses. Like people just opened their homes up to me that I had barely met, right?
Mm-hmm.
Friends of friends, family members of friends, all these different people. And when I was there, I connected with them. And as a payback, because I didn't have a ton of money at the time, I was like, you know what is your job? I will go and help you with your job for the next day or two. And I'm going to like experience these different things. So one of the things was I went and, made Argentinian pastries at 3:00 in the morning. And another one was he did a estate sale. So I just went and did an estate sale with him and learned that. Yeah. So anyway, so the whole thing, the reason why I bring up that story was because that story, that experience in retrospect, which happened 15 years ago for me, roughly was an experience where I realized the true nature of humans, right? Yeah. And how connection really matters. And that was important for my journey. And from that point on to the end and until now. I'm not saying this is the end. That would be terrible.
Yeah, this is no, thank you for
the end. Hopefully it's going up from here. But speaking of that, like that's something that I was a real concern of mine when I was leaving, was like, is this all there is? Like, did I just like go to the top of the mountain and then just drop? Like, yeah. is that's what I thought, because, I had been let go and I was like, couldn't understand it. And that experience just led me to, in a way, grief, right?
Yeah.
It's a grief process, right? Of losing this thing that I birthed into the world, innovation.gov and the Better Government movement, right? And interestingly enough, the last thing I'll say about that is, like, you talked about your father passing away. Yeah. And as part of my story and my journey is after around Christmas 2018 is when I leave. And I think that's when I physically saw you last, maybe.
Yeah. It was, and that's where I come in, and where I didn't go into the details, but where I'm like, I've seen Amy along this journey at different pivotal points, including as you knew you were leaving. It's wild, but December 2018.
Yeah, December 2018 is when I was leaving, and I was like, you know what? This time I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to react in a different way. Something significant happened to me. I am fortunate to have the wherewithal and money to go and take a sabbatical, right? Because I had gone on vacations in a couple of years, right? Mm-hmm. So I saved all that money up and was able to be like, I'm going to just focus on me for a while and process what happened, figure things out, look at my past. And I talk about this in my book too, is like, we have to look at our past and see what made us who we are and see what works and what isn't working. And that's what I needed to do during that time, and to process what happened. And that's when I started writing this book, right? This gave me this freedom for me to start thinking through and being cathartic. But before I even started writing the book, I decide I'm going to go travel the world by myself, right? So I decided to go to India and Thailand to learn how to cook the food, soak in the culture, and everything like that. And actually, this is yesterday. Yeah, yesterday was my 2-year anniversary of me leaving for my trip in 2019. Wow. So, Facebook likes to remind you of these things.
How long were you there?
I was going to be there for about 2 months between India and Thailand. But I get my way to Bangkok. I had finished my first travel of like northern Thailand to learn about all the food and the culture, and it's gorgeous. And I was getting ready to go on a sailing adventure in South Thailand, which sounds incredible. And I wish I was there right now because it is freaking cold here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So, but I was in Thailand and I got a call from my mom. I was on a public bus in Bangkok, Thailand, coming back from a market, which I like to do, just travel like the locals do when I go traveling, which is, wild. Sometimes it's an old train truck. I'm the only person in the car, on the bus. But I get a call from my mom on that bus, and as I'm boarding the bus, and my mom says, "Your father, I don't know how to say this, but your father just fell and hit his head. He is being flown to shock trauma right now." And she's like, "He's in surgery, but things don't look good." And my mom was a nurse for 45 years, right? So when my mom says things don't look good, I could tell that things weren't going to be okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sitting here in Bangkok on a bus, like being surrounded by people that don't speak the language that I am. I feel utterly alone. And I'm like, I don't know how to process this. And I had to call my mom again because after I got off the phone with her, because I was like in shock and she was in shock. So eventually I ended up making my way back home, finding a flight back to go take 24-hour flight, 24 hours to fly back to DC. I mean, not to DC, well, to Baltimore and DC to find my father in a hospital in the ICU where he was brain dead. Mm-hmm. And I then was confronted and like with my sisters and my family and now saying goodbye to my father in an unexpected way. So I went from this eat, pray, self-love tour that I was feeling. And I was like, this is about me. This is about me feeling and like touring the world, to having to come back to family and reconnect and realizing how important it is. But at the same time, like now mourning my father. And I think in retrospect, I was ready to mourn and to grieve. And because of the grieving process that I had already been going through. Right. And I think I processed a lot of things very differently than my other sisters had, because I had slowed things down and I had processed the grief from before. And so I knew how to process grief. And so in a way, it made me more resilient in that experience. Yeah.
Wow. I just want you to keep going, because I'm like, so much of what you're saying, just to like stop for a second, it's all so powerful, because like, when would we, I mean, who knows, if we were sitting together and having a conversation about this, like maybe it would come, but it probably wouldn't come up. Like these are not, normally we don't dive into people don't dive into deep conversations like this. And I'm like kind of amazed, because you just even prompted like a question for me in all of this, because when thinking about your experience, like I could relate to like going back to my experience with my dad, for instance. Like he was in the ICU and he wasn't sick for a long time. He had a rare form of leukemia and was in the ICU a few weeks really, or a month before he passed away. But the thing that comes to mind for me is that at that same time, I was like it's sort of what you were saying around like grieving the loss of a type of work, because I was in the middle of the work I was doing. But to give you an idea, I was at Nike World Headquarters for an event in Portland. So flying out there for the first time, living my best life, you know, doing that. And then like at NASA headquarters a few weeks before for an event, and then in New Mexico for a work retreat. So I was going all over the place and could relate to you like flying and landing and going to the ICU, because I had that moment a few different times, you know, between these, like, okay, I'm going to go for a couple days, then come back. And so I relate to that. But the thing that came to mind was that talking about that, I think it's so easy for people. I'll share my experience. After losing my dad, like I went, you know, like there are times that I was able to travel internationally, and I went to Ethiopia one time. And I remember having that thought, it was like a very interesting couple of weeks there. I had a friend who was there at the time, but I went there, and I think at that time, which was within like the year of losing him, I had that like worry in the back of my head that like something might happen to someone, like a loved one, like my family or someone while I'm gone, or like to me while I'm gone, right? I know a lot of people who've experienced grief have these thoughts and experiences. And so I guess the question I have for you is almost how people, and I don't know if you have an answer for this because it's a big question, but like how people how people can potentially toe the line between like that fear that you might experience, like if you go somewhere, versus you shouldn't be afraid of going out and exploring and meeting people like you did on your cross country journey. Like, where's the line between that? Because I think so often the message is like, go out there and do it. But also, as you said, there are so many things that keep us anchored to where we are. So this is like a tough question, but I think that's an important one, right?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting because I'm kind of bringing this analogy in because I talk about so I'm single and I'm exploring the world of online dating during a pandemic, right? And so I have this conversation with my friend Jimena, and she and I talk about, and she's also single, and we're like, it's terrible trying to date people during it. And she's just like, I'm so full of anxiety because she thinks that she's going to get COVID, right? And in this dating world. And so, and I'll get around to like how this connects to what we're saying in a second. But what it comes down to in the conversation is like, it's a matter of amount of risk you're willing to take in the world, right? When you go and do these things. And so like when I go out with somebody, like, yes, there's a risk that I might get COVID, right? From this person that I'm dating. But at the same time, you have to trust, there has to be a modicum of trust that you need to have in the world. And so when I think about what you said is, I didn't necessarily like fully internalizing like I did right now, because I feel like I'm fully open to the universe, right? And trying to see where the universe is going to take me. Even when it comes to this book, like when people say, what is your future? What are you planning on doing with like this book and your company and your organization? I was like, that's a good question. I'm just going to be like, go where the wind takes me, right? And like, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in the pandemic. And we're all in this like anxiety and depression and all these different things. So I don't know tomorrow if I will want to get out of bed, right? Because I'm so depressed. Yeah. So like, I'm just going to take it day by day, right? And see where it takes me. And so like, I think that mentality of like, I think there's so many things that block us from feeling, I talk about feeling empathy for other people, but I think having empathy for ourselves. And also this idea of like, when we go into the world, a lot of us are afraid of what that thing is going to be, of X, Y, and Z, right? Like I traveled in India by myself, right? Which is not an easy thing. I do have family in India because my sister is married to an Indian man, but I think that for me, it was just like, okay, there is fear, but I'm willing to take the risk because I think the reward of doing this and having this experience is better than the risk I take of me being at home. I'm not saying you should go traveling internationally during the pandemic, something I'm doing, but I'm just saying pre-pandemic, it was like, you know what? I'm doing this cross-country road trip. My friends want to do this. Sure, I'll do this, right? I've never left. I haven't really left the East Coast before. And at the time, right? So I'm like, I'm going to travel around the country, drive around by myself in a car and sleep in my car. Like I was like a vagabond for like 3 months. So like that experience just was like, it makes me so much richer as a person, made me curious and made me realize the dignity of humans, right? These are things that come up in the book, like built my empathy muscle because I had to kind of evolve and adjust and be part of kind of humanity for a while.
Wow. Yeah, this is so deep. There's so much there. You mentioned, I'm glad that you brought it back around to your book though, too. And because one question that I ask at the end of each and every one of my interviews is just about your, I know, right? I'm like, we're popping back out. It's like, there's a whole flow here, but I want to ask, like, beyond Empathy for Change, available on bookshelves everywhere. Check it out. And I'll give you time to plug that all in a second. I want to ask about your life and your story. And I've gotten so many different sides of that. So I'm really thankful for this conversation already, and I have to listen back. But I want to ask, like, if your life were a book or documentary, Amy, what would the title be and why?
Gosh, you probably should have told me this before.
I'm like,
No,
I'm
but
curious.
it's so
to hear
funny
your
because if you look at my family like laughs at me because I always say I watched this documentary once, and like it's a freaking joke because I always like watching a documentary about something and I'm like learning something and I'm telling my family about it. But lately it's been podcasts. Like I listened one of my favorite podcasts and I talk about Throughline. It's called Throughline on NPR. Amazing. So this story, I mean, that story was like, I mean, I learned about the Bronze Age and stuff like that. So this is like part and parcel of who I am. Another aspect of me, which you didn't get earlier, is like I helped like co-create like a documentary film school, right? And like years ago, and that's where some storytelling comes in. I like helped I was on the board. I was helping this nonprofit out. So I'm pretty sure you're asking for like a short answer, but I'm going to give you the long answer. But when it comes to a documentary, you know what? The title would, I think what's really fascinating is that it probably would be the same title that my book is. Because I think what is happening in the book is who I am, right? I'm a change maker. I am a person who makes people think differently, makes people also have empathy for each other. And I have forgotten that piece about me for a really long time. And this book and this journey has led me to realize like how much of a strength and a superpower that is. So, I mean, I think that's what I would say because, it's both of those aspects of me, but then I have had this aha moment where it's like, oh, that's also the reason why, like, that's also what we need to create change today, right? Yeah. We need both empathy to create change and to act upon the empathy that we have for each other. So I think that's what I would say.
I'll just +1 that title too, because talking about your story and just everything we've talked about over the last hour, which is just kind of breezed by, like it's so clear that who you are is so deeply embedded in the work that you do. And I think a lot of people could say that, but I wish more people could say that actually, that they bring themselves to work and that they, help, that they allow themselves to be visible and they allow all of their talents and skills and all of that stuff to like manifest in the things that you put out. So for me, it's like putting out a film, the 20s and Change film, and sharing that through Let's Care. But for you, it's like this book right now and all these other things that you've created, which I don't think that we are not the work. We're definitely not the work. We're a lot more than what we do, so to speak. But at the same time, it's so interesting to like look at someone who really leans into who they are and what they create, because it ends up really being a strong reflection of them. So Empathy for Change definitely makes sense for your book title. And where, just as actually a follow-up question I wanted to ask really quickly, who would write the foreword of that book if you had someone, whether it's someone you know or someone that you admire, who would you like to write the foreword of that book?
Oh gosh.
Or documentary, whatever. I don't know.
Forward.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I find it because I've been leaning into poetry a lot. So like I was like, I want to get a poet to do it. And I love slam poetry. Dated a couple slam poets in my day. But I think what I would say just in this moment, because I'm in this moment with you, is I have a sponsor named Laura in adult children of alcoholics. It's a 12-step program. It's more spiritual than it is religious, but it's a program where it's really looking at your past. I had an alcoholic family. I've talked about that before, and the family dynamics that come with it. And I have a sponsor, and over the past 2 years or so, we've been growing our friendship, probably more like 2.5, 3 years. But she has seen me at my worst. Like last year, I was in a really dark place. And then this year, I am like I'm launching a best-selling book. I just launched an article in Forbes magazine. Like, I'm living my best life, and I think that I would want her to do that forward, because she has seen me at my worst, and also sees me at my best. And she's been fortunate to be the person, fortunate or unfortunate, to be the person to see me on that journey and be open and to hear my innermost thoughts, which is such a special thing. And it's like, I'm getting teary-eyed just thinking about it. So I love you. You're great.
Oh, you're amazing. And I'll just ask, because we wrap up, one, thank you for sharing your story and your incredible, the power of like conversation and connecting is really incredible. Where could people just plug your things, Amy? Where could people check the book, your website, everything else? Just feel free to
follow me on the socials. I'm active on all the social media mostly. I think I try to focus more on LinkedIn, because it's a lot of the stuff is doing organizational development. LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Most of them say at realamyjwilson.com, or not .com. Don't say .com and when you do that. But you can also go to amyjwilson.com. On there, I have a whole page about my book and the things that I've done. And also, I have a publication on Medium called Empathy for Change: How to Create a More Understanding World, where I'm bringing snippets from the book. But at the same time, I want you to buy the book. And I would love for you to tell me how it hits you. And I'm creating intentional spaces where people can be heard and seen. And so I would love to hear people's stories and how it hit them. And also, write me a review if you choose to do so on or elsewhere. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll absolutely write a review. But thank you so much. Again, I keep saying it, and I'm sure I'll say it after we stop recording. But thank you so much just for sharing yourself and showing up. And my hope, to tie your book to this, is that people could learn more about your story, have more empathy for you, but also experiences and people who share those experiences and characteristics. And just be more open-minded to the people who could show up and make the world a better place, which I know is something you've definitely done. So thank you so much, Amy. And as I say at the end of each and every one of my interviews, keep impacting. Please keep impacting.
Will do, 100%.
Awesome.
Thanks.